Please pray with me. Dear Lord, thank you for this day. Thank you for establishing local congregations where we can meet together with brothers and sisters in you, worship you and encourage and edify one another. As we study your word today, help us to do just that and to glorify your name and to edify one another. And it's in the name of your Son that we pray. Amen.
And our new memory verse, barely up on the board. 1 Kings 18, verse 37. Answer me, Lord, answer me, so these people will know that you, Lord, are God, and that you are turning their hearts back again. Is there anything from last week that you want to start class off talking about this week? 2 Samuel 16 through 24, 1 Kings 1 and 2. You got it all.
There were only 4 of us here.
We get into First Kings. Is there anything that you felt like has changed very much as we get into First Kings versus First and Second Samuel? Pretty similar type of writing, type of narration, maybe. Anything different, unique? We're definitely in, obviously, by the title of the book, we're definitely well into this period of Israelite history. We'll see the prophets come into play through these stories, but we're well outside of the Judges period. Samuel's gone. It's definitely monarchy at this point. What kind of things have you noticed in First Kings so far? What things have stood out to you? Maybe themes or messages or repetitions? Anything stand out to you so far in these first 13 chapters?
I'd say the conditional nature of God's blessings on Solomon. And reflecting back on Solomon's dad, also what's happened afterwards, this notion of if you will, and then it doesn't take long for Solomon, so you kind of go on.
The conditional nature of God's promises. It's kind of interesting as we read through some of that. God always seems to say something to the effect of Solomon, if you follow my commandments, this promise will continue for you. If not, here's your punishment. Now, for the sake of David, because he obeyed, here's the little bit that I'm going to reserve, a little bit of judgment that I'll reserve. Maybe, I'm not going to take the whole kingdom. I'll leave a tribe with your son. For the sake of David's obedience, it is interesting how even in the conditional nature that he's making the promises to Solomon, he's still preserving his promises that he made to David, that the promises he made there would still be fulfilled, even though Solomon, as we read this week, will fall and turn away from God himself. What else?
I feel like the attitude of David really stands out because you see him sinning terribly. And maybe just at first reading, you may wonder, well, why would God bless him while he rejected Saul and then later on Solomon? But really, I think David's a good example of what it means to be after God's own heart, that he sought God even after he sinned. He didn't continue in his sin or let his heart turn away from God. Certainly had moments in his life where he was guilty, but he turned back to God.
If we just took a picture of different points in David's life, a lot of characters in the Bible, we might look at that picture, say, yes, they're faithful, or no, they're not. Even with Solomon, we have pictures of Solomon where we could say, this is the ideal, this is how we all ought to be, or David, this is a terrible guy. We see that he's not defined by these individual moments, rather his response to those moments and a pattern of behavior that we see make him that man after God's own heart. What else?
This is the period in which it's the high water of the kingdom. So everything seems to be going really well with Solomon, and he's building the temple and the palaces and the other buildings, and he's raising armies, and he's got this massive workforce, and he's collaborating with other kingdoms to bring cedar and gold, and he's got tribute coming in, and everything's going really well. Until, as Stu mentioned, all of his hundreds of women, concubines, wives and concubines turn his heart. It's sad, it's just this, you see this pinnacle, this grand rise, and it just crashes with the divided kingdom.
I mean, at the same time, everything seems to be going great for the nation, but Solomon is a pretty awful king by God's standards. If we look back in Deuteronomy chapter 17, starting in verse 14, when you come to the land which the Lord your God is giving you and possess it and dwell in it, I say, I will set a king over me like the nations that are all around me. You shall surely set a king over you whom the Lord your God chooses. One from among your brethren you shall set as king over you. You may not set a foreigner over you who is not your brother. But he shall not multiply horses for himself. Solomon does that. Nor cause the people to return to Egypt to multiply horses. Solomon does that. For the Lord has said to you, you shall not return that way again. Nor shall he multiply wives for himself, lest his heart turn away. Certainly see that with Solomon. Nor shall he greatly multiply silver and gold for himself. Solomon does that. Seems like, several boxes in a row that God says don't do, Solomon does to an extreme. So, I mean, even though, there's prosperity and it looks like things are going well, and certainly by human standards, everything is great, God's got a different standard.
Definitely, as we read through this story, that is a good call out as we think back to Deuteronomy. It says reading through 1 Kings 8, the temple is complete and Solomon's dedicating the temple. The Lord blesses the work that's been done. There's a lot of that as far as the temple itself goes, God's pleased with. We continue reading about the various other buildings and the multiplying of horses and all the riches that are accumulated in the kingdom. And it's kind of interesting as we think about what's happening here. It's like Solomon is setting himself up for that climax of when he turns. You'll see that there's kind of as he collects more riches, as he builds his kingdom, as his wisdom is sought out from the other kingdoms around the world, they're coming to him. We don't read this verbatim, but you can almost imagine what's happening here is Solomon's relying less and less on God and more on himself. And maybe that'd be easy to do in a situation like Solomon's in, where he is so blessed, where people are coming, seeking after him. What else stands out to you?
Well, it is interesting that early on, like when God asked Solomon what he can give him and he asked for wisdom, like he doesn't ask for like the riches or the long life or anything. He asks for wisdom, and God blesses him with all those other things because of that already predisposed wisdom, I guess. It's just interesting how it kind of turns, and even though he is the wisest man, we can also not use our wisdom or misuse it.
We look in 1 Kings chapter 3. This is something that I thought might be an interesting discussion for us. The Lord appeared to Solomon and says that in verse 5, at Gibeon, the Lord appeared to Solomon in a dream by night, and God said, ask, what shall I give you? I don't know if there's any context to this dream other than that, as far as it's reported for us. There's no condition put, there's no stipulations for the type of thing that Solomon could have asked or requested of God. God just says, ask, what shall I give? Why do you think? Or what attitudes do we read likely drove Solomon to ask for wisdom?
The way you. His perspective on himself, I think it's interesting. Because he looks at himself as, hey, I'm a youngster, I don't know what I'm doing, I don't know what's, people are going in and coming out, and I'm just not, maybe not cut out for this, role. Too many to be numbered. I don't know how to go out or come in. And so he's asking, he seems to be rather humble. And he starts off in verse 3, out of love, as Solomon loved the Lord. Good heart. That's the way I read that.
He loves the Lord, he has a good heart. He really puts his display of humility on here as he responds to God, beginning in verse 6. What else stood out to you about how Solomon goes about asking for wisdom?
Well, I was just thinking about 1 Kings chapter 2, where David is giving instructions to Solomon. And among the things he tells him to do is in verse 6, he says, therefore do according to your wisdom and do not let his gray hair go down to the grave in peace. And he's talking there about Joab and what Joab did. And really, I guess as I read through this, what I notice is that what David's telling Solomon to do, at least for me, would be kind of a difficult thing to think about. Wait a minute, I'm supposed to decide the fate of these various men that had to do with my father's administration and really my father's time as king. Shimei is going to be executed. We see Abiathar is going to be executed by Solomon. So in thinking through all those decisions he was going to have to make, I don't know if that was motivating him at the moment that he asked God for wisdom or not, but it seemed like it would make sense.
Anything else stand out? I think there's just something to be said for his immediate words. What shall I give you? And Solomon said, you have shown great mercy to your servant David, my father, because he walked before you in truth and righteousness and uprightness of heart with you. You have continued this great kindness for him, and you have given him a son to sit on his throne as it is this day. As we just read verse 6, and God says, what shall I do for you? And the immediate thing that Solomon reflects on is how God preserved David and why God preserved David. He seemed to understand the connection here between obedience and the blessings of God, that the mercy of the Lord came to David because of how David obeyed. He acknowledges and seems to understand the relationship with God. He credits God with preserving the kingdom. He knows it's not David who's built this kingdom. It's not, it wasn't in their fleshly strength that this kingdom has persevered and that he's now the king on the throne. It's the Lord sustained. The Lord has brought him this far. It's almost like God says, what shall I do for you? And Solomon's responding, look at what you've already done. So he's acknowledging that. He shows this humility that Steve's talking about in verse 7. But I am a little child, how my version reads. I do not know how to go out or come in. And your servant is in the midst of your people whom you have chosen, a great people, too numerous to be counted. Therefore give your servant an understanding heart to judge your people, that I may discern between good and evil, for who is able to judge this great people of yours? It's like he's almost overwhelmed by the task of leading the people and all the various judgments that he's going to have to make on different people's fates. And what, just how to govern, and he wants help. It is interesting that, if we put ourselves in Solomon's shoes and God appeared to us in a dream, and he said, ask, what shall I give you? It's kind of a challenge to think, do I have the same attitude or character as Solomon to sit there and ask for something so meaningful? Because God acknowledges you could have asked for anything, and this is what you asked for. All right, I'm gonna give you that and all these other things. It's kind of an interesting, maybe thought challenge for each of us to think about. If you were Solomon, what would you have asked for in that situation?
Well, you are also causing me to think about all the upheaval within the administration of David and the rebellion against him. And, if you're about to become king, and even you see Abiathar, you see Adonijah, all these A names. You see Adonijah rising up, claiming himself to be king. There's just so much. Solomon had experienced so much competition in seeing how his father's kingdom had played out. He had just been a witness to all that, and think about being in the position of king with all that history or all that knowledge of what happened in your father's kingdom, knowing how to deal with that sort of opposition. And I guess what I'm thinking is that a lot of us would choose to have just a peaceful life ahead of a life of great wealth and prosperity. So perhaps that has something to do with it as well.
Sure. God blesses Solomon here. He promises to give him this wisdom. Solomon awakes. He realizes this has been a dream. He offers sacrifice to God. And immediately in the text, I didn't know what period of time has passed since this dream and this next story we read about here in chapter 3. The story really kind of stands out to me. It's interesting. Verse 16 through the end of chapter 3, Solomon's asked for wisdom, and now his wisdom is kind of put on display here. What's interesting about this story to you, or what stands out to you? What comments, questions, thoughts do you have about the story here in verse 16 through 28?
To me, it's one of the most profound examples of just incredible wisdom that God gave him.
Yeah.
It's an amazing story.
Great example of wisdom. I think about what he was asking for in verses 7, 8, and 9. When he's asking for wisdom, he's asking for an understanding heart to judge the people. I can't help but wonder if Solomon's thought process was, I'm going to be helping harlots decide whose kid like this was. Like, it seems like a very, in the grand scheme of things, this story seems like a very small matter. When you think about all the things that Solomon could have had on his mind when he's thinking about the wisdom that he's asking for and the situations that he's going to be confronted with, and immediately, and I don't want to downplay this story, like it's a very sad story. There's the death of a child and some bad attitudes on display here, but it's just so interesting that it's a relatively, in the eyes of the people, it would be some of the most insignificant people. It's harlots, it's the kids of harlots, there's not a lot of significance here. But Solomon's wisdom, despite who these people are, he still offers wise and verse 28 stood out to me. And all Israel heard of the judgment which the king had rendered, and they feared the king, for they saw that the wisdom of God was in him to administer justice. So even in this seemingly insignificant situation, as far as the people involved, this story spread. So whatever period of time has happened from Solomon actually asking for wisdom and this event's taking place, seems to be the catalyst event, at least within the nation, for people to recognize that, okay, there's something special about this guy. The wisdom that he has is the wisdom of God. He's He's administering justice. This is justice from God. This isn't just Solomon coming up with an interesting solution to a problem here. This is the judgment of God being offered through this man. Anything else in chapter 3? So we move on then in chapter 4. There's a lot of information here in chapter 4 about Solomon's administration, different people and places and responsibilities. The end of chapter 4 is talking about Solomon's prosperity and wisdom. What things stood out to us in chapter 4? Why do you think we have so much detail reported about these names and places and all that we have in verses 1 through 19?
Sort of establishes the historicity of Solomon's reign. One of the impressive things about the Bible is that these places that are named, I'm not an archaeologist, but my understanding that many of these places have been discovered and their location is established based on exactly what the Bible said these places would be. The names of these men would also tend to establish the historical nature of this document rather than just it being a made-up story.
Yeah, and I was thinking about this, and a lot of times I read through this and I think, why the names, why the places, why is this so significant to me? And at least when I read through this, it kind of occurred to me, even if this isn't preserved for me, think back to who would have been reading this book when it was composed. We think back to when this book was written, we don't have a great reference in the book to say, here is when this was written. This was what was going on. This was the point in time. There's, at least in the study Bible I'm using here, there's a few dates that are put out as possibilities. There's, seems to be that the author of this study Bible seems to think that there's some weight to an argument saying that the completion of 1st and 2nd Kings likely would have been by somebody during the Babylonian captivity. I don't know. But if you're thinking about who would have been reading this, just for argument's sake, let's put ourselves there, where this was right around the captivity, in the captivity, just after the captivity. These are people who have lived through some pretty traumatic events. They've been in captivity. They're coming back to a land to repossess a land that was promised to them. And we think about what 1st and 2nd Kings has done for us. It's a retelling of history, and people probably should have known a couple of things for sure. They're a lot closer in line to these people and places and have a recollection of, who these people are that are being talked. I know there's, hundreds of years, but you think back, that there's probably a greater understanding and appreciation for the names and the places that are being talked about. It probably is pretty significant to the people who would have originally been reading this to know all this detail. And for us, when we come and we look at it, it is cool as we read through some of this. We were talking about this the other night. There's names of cities and places that we know still exist. They're still there. The geography lines up and makes sense. So think about even Zach's class on Wednesday nights, all the maps that he put up with all the different cities that Israel conquered, and actually being able to visualize and see those and know that this land is still over there. This stuff still exists out there, and we're finding and discovering, and we can go back and some of these places we can very easily prove exist and say, hey, here it is, here's a name that's associated with it, and they found something, and it's just further evidence of truth. So maybe it's kind of a dual purpose. Maybe I'm off on a tangent there, but as we get to Solomon's prosperity, his wisdom at the end of the chapter in chapter 4, and even when we get into chapter 10, verses 14 through 29, is there anything that like really just stands out to you about the prosperity and wealth that we read about in the kingdom? Matthew's already pointing out the things that they were accumulating were actually seem to be in contradiction to the law that was given in Deuteronomy 17. But anything else stand out to you about this accumulation of wealth and prosperity we read about?
Actually, in these chapters, I don't think it's talking about him accumulating silver and gold. There seems to be a turning point later where we start reading about Solomon's accomplishments later that turn out to be bad things, but in this, so far things seem to be going relatively well.
So if you do the comparison between chapter 4 to chapter 10, we're looking at chapter 4, like the good accomplishments. Chapter 10, we start to see the turning point, maybe. What else? I just can't help but sit there and think, what would I do with all this stuff? It's a lot of, yeah, it's impressive to think about. All the beauty that we're gonna read about with the temple in chapter 5 through 7, and even though we see the accumulation of silver and gold and all these things in the later chapters, we just kind of put ourselves as a citizen of the kingdom to see all of that in work or at work, all the shields and all the pillars and just everything that it talks about. It's very impressive to think about everything that they did. In chapters 5 through 7, we read about the planning and the building of the temple. Matthew?
Even going back in verse 25 stands out, and Judah and Israel dwelt safely, each man under his vine and his fig tree, from Dan as far as Beersheba, all the way north, all the way south, all the days of Solomon. So, it's not just Solomon, this is working out well for all the nation.
So the nation as a whole is, and I found some peace, some rest there. It's prosperity for all the people here.
And then this imagery of everyone under their own fig tree will get referred back to later in the prophets.
Sure.
Also think about Ecclesiastes. Think about Ecclesiastes when this Solomon talks about he was, the Proverbs and the Psalms and all the stuff that he with all the wisdom, and he spoke about beasts and birds and reptiles, and just that, I don't know exactly what that is. It seems like he had some understanding. Did he study them? Was he, what does that mean that he spoke of these things? But it seems on the heels of his understanding, wisdom, that he put some time and effort into understanding the nature, and he was a poet, song writer, and then on the heels of that, Ecclesiastes shows that he just, it was just a waste of his time, really. Essentially decided.
It is impressive to think about just all that Solomon used his wisdom for. As we read through all the fact that let's see what verses it talks about the numbers here. We talked about in verse 32, he spoke 3,000 proverbs and a song for 1,005. Actually go through our Old Testaments and flip through the Psalms and the Proverbs and read the texts that I believe is probably referring to at least some of what we have preserved for us in these books. It is impressive to think about all of that. Get into the construction of the temple. We could spend a lot of time going through all the detail of the temple for sure. Is there anything though that stood out to you as you read through the planning and the construction and completion of the temple? Really chapters 5, 6, and 7.
There's nothing like a major project to get the country united, behind the purpose, and it's a very holy purpose, to create a house for the Lord, which has been, God has always wanted, right? But David couldn't do it. And it's just, to me, it's really an incredible story of how well organized he was and collaborative he was and structured. And how the country really came around behind it. There were issues that came out of that later, but it was a magnificent building project.
From both the project itself and all the work that's gone into it, all the people that had to work together to make it happen. It's an impressive story for sure. I think it's interesting. This is the 418th year after the children of Israel come out of Egypt, the construction starts. We're 418 years after Egypt that we're now at this point that we're building this temple. What's the significance of the temple itself?
Well, his people. To be where they offer sacrifices and worship him for his presence.
This is not just symbolic of God's presence. Sometimes I think about that as it's almost symbolic of God's presence. It's not symbolic, like God's presence actually existed in this house. It's actually, it is interesting to read about that in one of the later chapters about the cloud coming over the temple and God's presence actually coming down and really like accepting this place as his house. I just thought it was interesting reading through this, that we're 418 years after Egypt. We read everything that Israel's been through in the conquest and with the judges, the various different captivities and periods of servitude that they've gone through. And it's like, this is finally the point in time where that's behind them. And it's time for this permanent dwelling place to be, constructed for God. David, why wasn't David allowed to do it? David wanted to, why wasn't he allowed to? Well, honestly, so he's still fighting, he's still a warrior, he's still at odds with the people. And don't want to pretend that there's not any sort of conflict that Solomon ever has to deal with, because we know that's true. But at this point, God has told David that, you aren't going to do it, but your son will. So Solomon has the opportunity to build the temple. We see Matthew pointing out the prosperity among all the people. We kind of see a point in time where it seems as if there's rest and peace in the land, and everybody's kind of content with what they have. Everybody's just overall good. There's not a lot of conflict things to be dealing with, and now we're building the temple, and that's going to be the focus for the next period of time. Anything significant stand out about the structure itself or the materials, or there's just so much detail that we have about it. What stands out to you?
I think how much gold was involved. Basically, then also think about Solomon later on talks about how God wanted to be clothed in darkness, and the holy place, ornate, beautiful, covered in gold, and yet nobody sees it. There's no light in there. There's nobody seeing that.
It's just an impressive thought to think about. They just build this beautiful, sounds beautiful anyway, impressive structure, and it's so private and personal. It's not for people's eyes to even take in. I thought verse 7 of chapter 6 was interesting. And the temple, when it was being built, was built with stone finished at the quarry, so that no hammer or chisel or any iron tool was heard in the temple while it was being built.
Good reference that one.
Like, there was just something so special about what they were doing that it wasn't this loud construction site. You know, there's a lot of reverence, a lot of respect for what they were doing. They had a vision in mind for what this was going to be, and they were showing, seems to be trying to offer some reverence and respect even in the building of it. Anything else?
I think about how there's so many people involved in this project, and we think about applications today, just as David was not able to complete the temple, but Solomon did it. Well, when Solomon built the temple, he employed thousands and thousands of people for different works they were to accomplish. I think about how that compares to us today in the church, and how there was no other creature on earth that could fulfill the work that God has given for man to do. But that doesn't mean that any one man is able to do all the work. And it also does not mean that any man deserves exaltation or credit as God deserves in fulfilling the work. We just are simply doing our part. And as we see here, when all these people worked together and did their part, including a few people that are named like Hiram and craftsmen and so forth, God is the one who receives glory for that.
Yeah, and we'll see that in chapter 8 when Solomon dedicates the temple. There's a lot of reflection on the blessings of God and what he's done for them, and even allowing this to happen. I think there are some good lessons for us in the church today. We think about all the work that went into the temple, and certainly have to think about what this was called. There was a book, it was written by several preachers, each has a chapter, do things well or something like that. One of the chapters talked about just even building maintenance and having, you know, a place of worship that's well kept and welcoming and not in shambles or things like that. And you know, obviously, we're talking about something very, very different from the temple, where God was actually dwelling with the people in the Old Testament versus a church building today. But if we just think about the attitude that drove the people to do what they did, wanted to build a place where they could, where God would dwell, where they could go approach him and worship him, and there was so much reverence and respect for what they were doing. So much, there's very meticulous work that was done to put this together and maintain it and upkeep it. And so maybe there's some lessons there about just for us today in the church, from just even the facilities that we have, but maybe even more significantly than that, we as the people, as the church, the work and the upkeep, and God actually dwelling with us as individuals, as people in our lives today. Our lives should be lived, you know, kind of the meticulous nature that these people put into the work of building the temple in these chapters. How long did it take them to build the temple? 7 years. How long did it take them to build his house? That is an interesting, just you get to chapter 7, it's like the but. Took them 7 years to do this. It's super impressive, but took them 13 years to build his house. Is there anything that could speculate a lot about that, I guess, but when I think about that, is there anything that really stands out to you about having that statement in there? Took them 7 years, but took them 13 years to finish his house.
At least they had the priorities right. They did the temple first.
Temple was first.
I'm not sure about the. I do think the palace and all the house of the forest of Lebanon and the other buildings. I mean, it was a complex palace There were a number of buildings,
Yeah.
other than just the temple, so maybe that can account for it.
And a lot of stuff had to happen.
Yeah.
So a lot of governing was more than just, the priests involved, so there's administration. So I think the really interesting thing is that, he built one for his, apparently the number one wife, from Egypt. And I think it's in First Chronicles, it says that the reason he did that is because that he didn't want her to live in the house of, in the house of David, because it had been holy. So even then you recognize that there's this Egyptian wife that he has, that she's not fit to live in the place where the ark had been.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, that's interesting, and I do want to get to that because you know, to me, as we read through chapter 7, I'm not sure that the but statement here is really a like, but hold on, let's look at this kind of failure necessarily. I think it's almost however this is written, it's just a telling of history. It took them 7 years to do that, but it also took them 13 years to build all this other stuff that was around as well. Not sure that that's necessarily a criticism that it took them 13 years. Lots of important stuff through chapter 7, lots of detail that's talked about. Chapter 8 with the ark being brought into the temple. And through the end of the chapter, we see there's his speech to the people at the completion of the work. He has a prayer of dedication, and then he turns and he blesses the assembly again, followed by dedicating the temple. So whatever this format, this presentation looks like here at the end of chapter 8, there seems to be a lot of pomp and circumstance around, like the temple is complete. There's a lot of call back to God and what God's done, obviously the prayer to the Lord. We get to chapter 9. We can spend time in chapter 8. I'm going to talk about chapter 9 because now God's appearing to Solomon again. So chapter 3, we have God appearing to Solomon. In chapter 9, God appearing to Solomon. And at the very, very least, there's at least 13 years that's gone by. Probably a longer period of time from time 1 to time 2, but at the very least 13 years, because the first appearance was before he started building. It at least took him 13 years to finish building all the other buildings. There's a spur of dedication, and now God's appearing to him again. So I'm going to say probably at least 13 years. But if you look, 1 Kings 3 to 1 Kings 9, 2 appearances. What's different about them?
It's pretty dire warning here in chapter 9. If you and your sons all turn from following me and do not keep my commandments and my statutes, which I have set before you, let go and serve other gods and worship them. It's almost like God is saying, you're getting close to failing here. At all, to me,
Yeah.
you know. And if you do not keep my commandments, my statutes, then we're gonna cut you off. And, you know. It's all gonna fall apart.
And all the beautiful stuff you built, there's gonna be a heap of ruins.
Yes, yeah.
Put in all this work. It's going to all be gone if you don't follow my commandments. Chapter 3, we have a dialogue. Ask, what shall I give you? Solomon does most of the talking in that appearance. It's Solomon addressing God, responding back to God. We see God blesses him at the end of that. Chapter 9, this appearance is God setting some things straight with Solomon. It seems like okay, you've done all this, you've dedicated a temple, you've put the ark there, you've done all this work. Now you better keep it up. Like, you better keep following, because if you don't, here's the consequence. Anything else in chapter 9 that or at least right here with this second appearance that was significant to you?
It's interesting, the same chapter that Solomon gives gifts to Hiram, you know, for his loyalty and for providing the cedar and the cypress and gold and all of that. So Solomon gives Hiram 20 cities, but Hiram doesn't really like them. So he says, what kind of cities are these that you've given me, my brother? He calls them Kabul, which means worthless or something.
Yeah.
I thought that was just kind of humorous, actually.
was funny, yeah, Matthew.
It's also somewhat disturbing, is Solomon giving away the inheritance that God had given to Israel? Like, it says they're in the land of Galilee, that sounds like part of the land that was promised to Israel, not, some foreign nation that Solomon had captured.
Yeah,
It mentions that Hiram was I don't know if it's the same Hiram, but it mentions when he talks about building that Hiram was the son of the widow of Naphtali. So he was at least half.
sure.
That was this craftsman, wasn't it?
So is that a different Hiram?
I think so.
Yeah.
Hiram was the
I think it's Hiram.
It's interesting, they both from Tyre.
Right, so that's why it's kind of confusing about that.
We can pick sides and debate it if you want.
I also think it's interesting that Tyre is mentioned here because, in Jesus' day, he talks about Tyre and Sidon had seen these great works that delivered and so forth. So, in other words, God's provision for man, there really it involved, for better or worse, involved the participation of people from all sorts of different places and backgrounds, even ethnicities at times. But God's people stood out as those who were chosen and blessed by him. So God's working through the facilitation of all men to accomplish his will, that his ultimate promise will be fulfilled in Christ, and all of these things are really pointing to Jesus.
I want to jump ahead to chapter 11 here with Solomon's heart turning from the Lord. And probably finish class here. There's just a few minutes left, it looks like. So Solomon's heart turns from the Lord. When we think about this, there's an easy answer to this, but what caused Solomon's heart to turn from the Lord? Sin. So he sinned. Specifically, he's taken all these wives from foreign lands. But Steve, you mentioned something that got me thinking about this. What was significant about Solomon's dealings with these wives? God's warned them not to take wives from other nations. God's already warned them about that. So I don't want to set that aside. That's definitely a problem, but how does he interact with these wives?
You actually facilitated their worship of foreign gods, setting high places and idols, and even himself going after those, and turned from holy following God.
So we look at examples of like Rahab, for example. Rahab was not an Israelite, but she's accepted by God. She's part of the lineage of David now, or of David, of Jesus, is what we're getting to, right? Because she becomes integrated. She chooses to follow God. It's really interesting that not only is Solomon taking wives from other nations, he also over here on the other hand, like, let's keep them separate. I'm gonna build her a special house over here because she doesn't need to be here with all this holy stuff that's going on. We'll also just build her own high places over there. And it's kind of like, there's never an attempt, at least it doesn't seem, to ever integrate them into for lack of a better way to say it, the Israelite culture. There was never an attempt to say, hey, come follow the Lord. I'd be interested to know what would have been different maybe in his story and his faithfulness had he actually brought those women truly into his life and encouraged them to follow the Lord. Again, that doesn't set aside the command not to take wives from other nations, so I don't want to minimize that, but it is interesting that he gathers all these wives, all these women, yet he keeps them kind of at arm's length from the Lord. Don't ever come in, don't ever be a part of the holiness that's here. some, maybe some poor decision making, I don't know, just something to be thinking about. For us maybe as we go to next week. Next week's reading, we're through the rest of First Kings and the first two chapters of Second.